It was the spring of 1960, and the world seemed to be breathing a careful sigh of relief. The mushroom clouds of the Second World War had faded into history, the rubble of Berlin and Tokyo had been swept away, and for the first time in 15 years, there was talk, fragile, hesitant talk, of coexistence. Yet beneath that polished surface of diplomacy, two superpowers were circling each other like predators in the dark, each pretending to seek peace while preparing for the next inevitable confrontation. The Cold War had settled over the planet like a low, invisible fog, silent, suffocating, and everywhere at once. In Washington, the atmosphere was one of quiet vigilance. The United States had emerged from the last war as the most powerful nation on Earth, its wealth unmatched, its military untested by defeat. But across the vastness of Eurasia, behind the barbed borders of the Soviet Union, a new empire had risen, a rival armed not just with ideology, but with atomic fire. The memory of Sputnik still haunted American skies. The metallic sphere that had circled the Earth in 1957 was more than a scientific triumph. It was a message from Moscow, a reminder that the Soviet Union could reach into the heavens before America even looked up. In that era of uncertainty, information became the new weapon. Washington needed to know what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, how many missiles the Soviets possessed, where their bombers were hidden, and whether the rumors of intercontinental rockets were fact or fear. The traditional tools of diplomacy were useless against such secrecy. Satellites did not yet exist, and reconnaissance planes could not fly high enough to escape Soviet radar. The answer came from a place few in the public had ever heard of, a nondescript hangar in the California desert known only as Skunk Works. Under the direction of Lockheed engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, a team of designers and mechanics worked day and night on an aircraft so radical that it bordered on science fiction. It would be long, slender, and impossibly light, with wings that stretched like a glider's and engines built to scrape the edge of space. The CIA called it Article 347, but history would remember it as the U-2. At 70,000 feet, it could photograph entire cities in a single pass, capturing details small enough to identify a missile silo or even the shadow of a moving truck. The plane's pilots, all volunteers, were sworn to secrecy and trained to survive missions they were told might never officially exist. From 1956 onward, the U-2 became America's silent eye in the sky. It drifted above Soviet nuclear test ranges, missile fields, and submarine bases, too high to hear, too far to stop. Every photograph it returned was studied like sacred scripture inside the Pentagon, each image a new revelation about Soviet strength or weakness. For 4 years the missions continued without loss, and the illusion of invincibility took root. CIA officials assured President Eisenhower that the U-2 flew higher than any interceptor could reach. Soviet air defenses, they claimed, were helpless beneath it. But in Moscow, humiliation was festering. Each unauthorized flight across Soviet territory was an insult to the nation's pride, a public reminder that even the world's largest army could not defend its skies. Premier Nikita Khrushchev raged privately at his generals, demanding an answer. New radar stations were erected across the Urals, experimental surface-to-air missiles were deployed in secret. The order was clear and absolute: the next American plane that entered Soviet airspace would not return home. As the calendar turned toward May 1960, Eisenhower prepared for a historic summit in Paris, one meant to mark a thaw in Cold War tensions. For the first time, there was hope that the two superpowers might discuss disarmament, perhaps even the first steps toward lasting peace. In that climate of optimism, the CIA requested authorization for one final reconnaissance flight over Soviet territory. It was to be routine, they said, just a quick photographic sweep to confirm the location of several new missile installations before the summit began. The president hesitated, but in the end he agreed. It would be the last mission before diplomacy took the stage. What no one in Washington realized was that the final flight would not be routine at all. The Soviets were waiting, their missiles primed, their radar locked on the sky. And as one pilot named Francis Gary Powers climbed into his pressure suit in the early dawn of May 1st, a chain of events had already begun, one that would pierce the veil of secrecy, expose a superpower's deception, and turn the illusion of peace into a storm of global outrage. The morning of May 1st, 1960, broke over the deserts of Pakistan with a thin, colorless light. At a remote American base near Peshawar, men in plain uniforms moved with quiet precision, speaking little, their breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. The mission had been planned for weeks, its route charted down to the minute: take off before dawn, climb to 70,000 feet, cross the Soviet Union from south to north, and exit into friendly airspace above Norway. To the small circle of officials who knew, it was called Operation Grand Slam. To everyone else, it did not exist. In a small ready room, pilot Francis Gary Powers reviewed his checklist one last time. A former Air Force captain, he was calm, methodical, and used to flying alone above a world he could never mention. His aircraft, U-2 No. 360, was a gleaming sliver of metal built to touch the stratosphere. Fuel tanks were topped off, cameras loaded with miles of high-resolution film, and a tiny cyanide-laced needle was tucked inside his flight suit, a grim precaution should he ever be captured. The men who briefed him reminded him of two things: the altitude would keep him safe, and the world must never know. When the engines ignited, the sound was almost delicate, a high whine swallowed by the wind. The aircraft rolled down the runway, its long wings trembling as it lifted into the pale sky. Within minutes, the base below was nothing but dust and mirage. Powers began his slow ascent, climbing through thin air until the earth below lost its color. At 70,000 feet, the curvature of the planet was visible, a faint blue rim stretching endlessly toward the east. The cockpit was silent except for the hiss of oxygen. He crossed the border into Soviet airspace just after sunrise. Below him lay the vastness of Central Asia, deserts, rivers, and the distant ridges of the Urals. His cameras began their steady pulse, capturing frame after frame of forbidden terrain. For the CIA, these images would be invaluable: missile complexes near Turatum, bomber bases in the Volga region, nuclear facilities that intelligence analysts in Washington could only guess at. Every minute aloft added to the ledger of knowledge America sought to keep its enemies in check. But Powers did not know that his every movement was already being watched. On radar screens deep inside Soviet command bunkers, a thin streak of light traced its way northward. For years, those screens had shown mysterious intrusions, ghosts too high and too fast to touch. This time, something was different. Soviet technicians had recently activated a new generation of surface-to-air missiles, the S-75 Dvina, built precisely to destroy targets once thought unreachable. Orders came swiftly from Moscow: track the intruder, lock on, and prepare to fire. At 8:53 a.m., alarms erupted inside the control center near Sverdlovsk. Operators confirmed altitude, speed, and trajectory. The launch commander turned a key, and seconds later, white smoke blossomed from the forest below. Multiple missiles soared into the morning sky, twisting upward like burning arrows. On the ground, witnesses would later recall a faint boom followed by glints of falling debris, tiny silver fragments that caught the sunlight as they drifted down. High above, Powers saw a sudden flash of orange reflected in his canopy. The aircraft lurched violently, one wing tearing away as the fuselage exploded in a halo of fire. Instruments shattered, oxygen hissed, and the cockpit filled with acrid smoke. Training took over. He released the canopy, struggled against centrifugal force, and ejected. For a few moments there was only silence, then the rush of freezing air as his parachute deployed. Through the haze of drifting smoke, he saw pieces of his aircraft tumbling toward the fields below. When he hit the ground, the world was green and quiet. The parachute collapsed behind him, its white fabric tangled in the grass. Dazed and bruised, he tried to destroy what he could: maps, identification, fragments of equipment, but within minutes, local farmers had surrounded him. They were shouting in Russian, pointing rifles, uncertain whether he was a spy or a stranded pilot. Soviet soldiers arrived soon after, and there was no escape. The most secret mission of the Cold War had ended not in triumph but in capture. In Washington, it would take nearly a day for anyone to realize what had happened. The CIA waited anxiously for Powers's scheduled radio check-in, but no signal came. By evening, officials assumed the worst, that a mechanical failure had brought the aircraft down somewhere over remote terrain. Still, they hoped that altitude and secrecy would keep the mission hidden. A press release was drafted describing a high-altitude weather research plane lost near the Turkish border. It was thin, improbable, and meant to buy time. But in Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev was savoring a rare advantage. The wreckage had been recovered almost intact, the cameras unburned, the film undeveloped, and the pilot very much alive. He ordered silence for the moment, allowing Washington to issue its story before revealing the truth. What came next would not be a military engagement, but a masterpiece of political humiliation. The Soviet leader had caught his rival spying red-handed, and he intended to make the entire world watch as the mask of innocence slipped from America's face. Far above politics, in the still smoldering fields of Sverdlovsk, the remnants of U-2 No. 360 lay scattered across the earth, a torn wing, a shattered cockpit, fragments of film curling in the heat. The mission that was never supposed to be seen had now become the most visible secret on the planet. When news reached Moscow that the American intruder had been shot down, disbelief quickly turned to celebration. For years, Soviet air defenses had watched those high-altitude ghosts drift freely across their skies, untouchable and mocking. Now, finally, they had struck one from the heavens. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, ever the showman, sensed the opportunity immediately. He ordered the debris brought to Moscow under guard, every fragment to be catalogued, photographed, and displayed. Engineers were astonished at what they found: advanced cameras, specialized film, navigation systems unknown to Soviet science. It was a technological treasure chest dropped straight into their hands. But the true prize was not metal or machinery. It was the man who had fallen from the sky. Francis Gary Powers woke in a haze of pain inside a gray concrete cell. His pressure suit had been stripped away, his helmet gone, and the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and oil. Guards stood silently at the door, watching every movement. Within hours of his capture, he was transported under heavy escort to Moscow for interrogation. The KGB knew exactly who he was before he spoke a single word. His survival had stunned them. Most expected any pilot on such a mission to destroy himself rather than be taken alive. Yet here he was, alive, frightened, and holding secrets that could embarrass the most powerful nation on Earth. For days, Soviet officers questioned him without rest. They wanted to know how many planes, how many flights, how far into their airspace the Americans had gone. Powers answered carefully, giving only what he believed was already known. His training had been explicit: offer no information beyond name, rank, and the laws of war. But he was not a soldier anymore. Technically, he was a spy, and spies were not protected by conventions or treaties. Each answer risked being twisted into a confession. The Soviets filmed the interrogations, documenting every pause, every tremor, every flicker of fear. Khrushchev would use it all later. Meanwhile, in Washington, the situation was spiraling into confusion. The CIA clung to its cover story about a weather research aircraft lost near Turkey, convinced that the Soviets could not possibly know more. Eisenhower's advisors urged patience, believing the wreckage had been obliterated in the crash. The president authorized a statement repeating that the flight was purely scientific, not military. It was, in essence, a lie told for the sake of diplomacy, a fragile fiction meant to preserve peace. On May 7, Khrushchev shattered that illusion with theatrical precision. Standing before the Supreme Soviet, he declared that an American spy plane had been shot down deep within Soviet territory. He produced photographs of the wreckage, identifiable serial numbers, and, most damning of all, the living pilot. The hall erupted in applause. The Soviet leader smiled and paused for effect, letting his audience absorb the enormity of what he was saying. "Comrades," he announced, "we have captured the pilot, and he has confessed." Around the world, headlines exploded. Washington's weatherplane story was instantly exposed as a fabrication. In the Oval Office, Eisenhower was grim and silent. His advisors watched as the weight of the moment settled on him. The United States had been caught spying at the very moment it was preparing to ask for peace. There was no denying it now. Photographs of the U-2 wreckage appeared in every major newspaper. Soviet television replayed clips of the captured pilot under guard. America's credibility, carefully built through years of diplomacy, was disintegrating in front of the world. For Khrushchev, it was not enough merely to reveal the truth. He wanted humiliation. He invited foreign ambassadors to view the plane's remains in Moscow, each piece labeled like evidence at a crime scene. There, among the twisted metal, lay the pilot's flight suit, his survival kit, and even the needle of poison he had been instructed to use. It was the perfect propaganda victory, a symbol of Soviet vigilance, of American deceit, and of the fragile line between intelligence and aggression. Powers, meanwhile, was moved to a secure prison on the outskirts of Moscow. Each morning began with questions, each night ended under bright lights. His interrogators alternated between kindness and intimidation, offering cigarettes one moment, threats the next. He knew his words would be broadcast, his image turned into a tool of the state. He did not resist. There was no escape, no rescue to hope for. In his isolation, the mission replayed endlessly in his mind, the launch, the horizon, the flash of fire, the slow fall into an alien land. By mid-May, the diplomatic firestorm had consumed everything it touched. Eisenhower's Paris Peace Summit, planned for months, now hung by a thread. The world had seen behind the curtain, and what it found was not the face of peace, but the machinery of espionage. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, trust, so carefully negotiated, had evaporated in a single burst of flame over Sverdlovsk. The missile had found its target, but it was not just an aircraft that fell that day. It was the illusion that secrecy could ever coexist with diplomacy. In the days that followed Khrushchev's announcement, Washington became a fortress of whispers. Behind closed doors, the corridors of the White House filled with the shuffle of urgent steps and the murmur of damage control. The president's advisors, many of them veterans of wartime deception, argued about how much to admit. Some wanted a full confession, hoping honesty might blunt Soviet fury. Others insisted on silence. Deny everything, they said, and wait for proof. But proof had already been paraded through Red Square. The wreckage, the photographs, the pilot, all beyond dispute. The lie had already begun to rot in the open air. Dwight D. Eisenhower, usually calm and reserved, looked weary. He had spent his career commanding armies, shaping the architecture of post-war peace, and now, at the twilight of his presidency, his credibility was unraveling over a single spy flight. The CIA's director, Alan Dulles, accepted responsibility but offered no apology. The mission, he reminded the president, had been approved with the best intentions to gather intelligence, to prevent surprise, to keep the balance of terror from tipping into catastrophe. Yet that logic, once whispered only in the secrecy of intelligence briefings, now sounded like the rhetoric of aggression. For the first time, the world saw America not as the watchful guardian of peace, but as the intruder. When reporters pressed for answers, the administration clung to the cover story with brittle determination. They described the U-2 as a weather research aircraft, blown off course by malfunction. The statement was cautious, technical, and implausible. It might have sufficed in another era before Khrushchev unveiled his evidence. But on May 11th, the Soviet premier revealed the pilot's confession, broadcast over radio and printed in every major paper from London to Tokyo. The confession was carefully edited, scripted for maximum impact. I, Francis Gary Powers, admit I was flying a reconnaissance aircraft inside the Soviet Union. No one could deny it now. The president's silence only deepened the humiliation. At the United Nations, delegates from the Soviet bloc seized their moment. They condemned American hypocrisy, waving photographs of the wreckage before the world. The Soviet ambassador demanded punishment for imperialist crimes and mocked Washington's talk of peace. U.S. representatives, blindsided, struggled to contain the outrage. In capitals across Europe, allies who had quietly tolerated American surveillance now found themselves forced to choose between public condemnation and private complicity. For all its technical brilliance, the U-2 program had never been designed to withstand sunlight. The tension reached its peak as the long-awaited Paris summit approached. Eisenhower had hoped the meeting would be his legacy, a moment of reconciliation after years of brinkmanship. For months, diplomats had prepared agendas, drafted talking points, and rehearsed gestures of goodwill. Now, it threatened to become a public trial. On May 14th, Khrushchev arrived in Paris with a swagger that bordered on theatrical. He carried folders filled with photographs, maps, and intercepted communications, evidence designed not to persuade, but to humiliate. The Western leaders, Eisenhower, Harold Macmillan, and Charles de Gaulle, stood beneath the ornate ceilings of the Elysee Palace as Khrushchev demanded a formal apology. Eisenhower refused. He admitted, at last, that the flights had been authorized, but he defended them as a necessary measure of national security. The Soviet Union, he argued, had concealed its intentions for too long. The world's survival depended on knowledge, and knowledge sometimes required risk. Khrushchev's expression hardened. "You have lost the right to speak of peace," he said coldly, and walked out. The summit collapsed in less than 2 hours. Decades of cautious diplomacy disintegrated in the echo of closing doors. In the aftermath, the United States found itself isolated in ways it had never been before. The carefully maintained moral authority of the Western Bloc, the image of restraint and honor, had been stained by the revelation of espionage. American newspapers debated whether the president had been misled by his own intelligence chiefs or had knowingly gambled with peace. In Moscow, Khrushchev's approval soared. He had not only defended Soviet sovereignty but humiliated his rival on the world stage. To millions who watched from the sidelines, citizens of Europe, Asia, and Africa, the incident revealed the fragility of the superpower myth. Even the most powerful nations, it seemed, could stumble over their own secrets. Eisenhower's presidency would never recover. The summit that might have defined his legacy instead marked its quiet end. He would leave office months later, succeeded by a younger man whose campaign promised renewal and vigilance, John F. Kennedy. But the shadow of the U-2 would follow him too. The world had changed. The Cold War had shed its pretense of civility and entered an era of open distrust. From now on, no handshake, no treaty, no smile between leaders could erase the memory of a single American plane falling from the sky, and the storm of lies that followed it to the ground. The cell was small, square, and bare. Its only window was a slit of glass set high in the concrete wall, too narrow for even a hand to pass through. For months, Francis Gary Powers lived inside the rectangle of silence, his world reduced to the scrape of metal doors and the echo of footsteps in the corridor. The KGB kept him under near-constant watch, sometimes through the peephole, sometimes through hidden microphones embedded in the ceiling. He had become both prisoner and exhibit, the living evidence of America's deceit. Interrogations began each morning with the precision of a factory schedule. His captors shifted tactics constantly, one day cold and formal, the next almost gentle, offering tea, cigarettes, or the pretense of sympathy. They wanted him to describe the U-2's flight systems, the camera mechanisms, the training, the mission routes, details that might confirm what Soviet intelligence already suspected. Powers, worn down but cautious, told them little beyond what could not be denied. He had been flying under orders. His task was reconnaissance. His survival had been unplanned. Everything else he deflected with silence or weary repetition. But even silence has its own language, and the KGB's analysts studied it like a code. As the weeks passed, the interrogations turned into conversations. Powers found himself speaking with men who seemed more curious than cruel, engineers who admired the U-2's design, officers who respected his endurance. Yet he understood that every question, every casual remark, was another snare. His compliance was part of a larger theater, a performance to be recorded, edited, and eventually broadcast to the world. When the day of his public trial finally arrived, he was no longer simply a captured pilot. He was a symbol, a character in the Cold War's most elaborate pageant. The trial opened in August 1960 inside a grand Moscow courtroom transformed for spectacle. The Soviet press filled the galleries, foreign correspondents watched from the back rows, their notebooks ready. Powers was led in wearing a plain grey suit, his expression somber, his movements careful. The judges sat beneath the Soviet emblem, a hammer and sickle gleaming above red velvet drapes. Cameras clicked. The proceedings were translated into multiple languages, transmitted live on state radio. It was less a judicial inquiry than a broadcast confession, designed for propaganda rather than justice. The prosecutor read the charges slowly, his voice rising with rehearsed indignation, espionage, violation of Soviet airspace, aggression against the peace of nations. Each accusation was punctuated by applause from the carefully arranged audience. Powers listened in silence. When asked to speak, he stood and answered in a low, steady tone. He admitted to flying the mission but denied any intent to harm. His duty, he said, was reconnaissance, nothing more. The words were factual, restrained, devoid of defiance. Yet to the Soviets, they were enough. The verdict had been decided long before the trial began. He was sentenced to 10 years, 3 in prison, 7 in labor camp. The sentence was severe but calculated. The Kremlin had no interest in destroying him. A living prisoner was far more valuable than a dead one. Powers was escorted from the courtroom under flashing cameras, his image printed across newspapers from New York to New Delhi. In America, reactions were divided. Some viewed him as a victim of circumstance, a patriot trapped in politics beyond his control. Others whispered that he should have died rather than surrender, that his capture had shamed the service. Even within the CIA, opinions splintered. Officially, the agency disavowed him. Privately, they knew he had endured exactly as trained. Inside his cell, Powers marked the days with small scratches on the wall. He read Soviet newspapers, practiced Russian phrases, and wondered what would come of him. Letters from home arrived sporadically, censored and delayed. He thought of his wife, his friends, the life suspended somewhere between the headlines. Around him, Moscow moved on. The U-2 incident had already shifted from crisis to cautionary tale, yet he remained its most tangible remnant, a man caught between two empires, waiting for history to decide whether he was hero or pawn. What he did not know was that, far away in Washington and Moscow, quiet negotiations had already begun. Behind closed doors, lawyers, spies, and diplomats were exchanging names. Prisoners held by each side, agents captured in the shadow war neither government would acknowledge. Among them was a Soviet officer whose face Powers had never seen, but whose fate would soon be bound to his own. The world's most famous spy pilot was about to become the centerpiece of a trade that would unfold on a frozen bridge halfway between two worlds. The winter of 1962 settled heavily over Berlin. The air was sharp, metallic, filled with the scent of coal smoke drifting through a divided city. On one side stood the West, lit by neon and guarded by barbed wire. On the other, the East, grey and watchful, patrolled by soldiers who understood that one wrong step could ignite a global war. Between them stretched a river and a bridge, Glienicke, the narrow artery where empires sometimes met in silence. It was here, on a cold February morning, that the story of Francis Gary Powers would reach its quiet end. For nearly 2 years, Powers had lived as a ghost inside the Soviet prison system. His routine was simple and exacting: wake at dawn, endure questioning, read, sleep, repeat. The days blurred together until time itself seemed to dissolve. Then, without explanation, the pattern broke. Guards came early, offering him clean clothes and a razor. They handed him a new suit, grey wool with a modest tie, and told him he would be leaving Moscow. He asked where. They did not answer. He was taken to the airport under armed escort, seated beside officials who spoke little and smiled less. The engines roared, and the plane lifted into the grey sky, carrying him toward something he could neither imagine nor believe. Across the Iron Curtain, another man prepared for the same journey. Rudolf Abel, real name William Fischer, was a Soviet intelligence officer who had spent the last several years imprisoned in the United States after being caught in Brooklyn in 1957. To Washington, he was the perfect bargaining chip. To Moscow, he was a national hero in need of retrieval. Quietly, through layers of back-channel diplomacy, both governments had agreed to an exchange: Powers for Abel, one spy for another, each a mirror of the other's sins. It was a transaction born not from mercy but from mutual need, conducted through lawyers, envoys, and unmarked briefcases that carried the weight of two superpowers' pride. The morning of February 10th was bone cold, the river beneath Glienicke Bridge locked in ice. Soviet and American security details arrived separately, each claiming its side of the span. A handful of journalists waited at a distance, their breath fogging in the wind. Cameras were forbidden, but rumors had already begun to spread. The swap, they called it, as if it were a mundane transaction and not a moment of history unfolding in real time. Just before 8 a.m., two figures appeared from opposite ends of the bridge, walking toward each other through the mist. One was tall and pale, his overcoat buttoned tightly against the cold. The other walked slower, shoulders stooped, face drawn but calm. They met in the center without words. In that instant, the long shadow of the U-2 incident began to lift. Observers later described the moment as oddly anticlimactic. There was no ceremony, no handshake, only a brief pause, a nod, and the exchange of custody. Abel turned and crossed into the east, disappearing behind the gray cars that waited for him. Powers walked toward the west, his expression unreadable, his breath visible in the cold. The entire event lasted less than 10 minutes. Yet in those 10 minutes, the Cold War had briefly remembered that negotiation was still possible, that even amid the rhetoric of annihilation, two nations could recognize the value of life over pride. When Powers returned to the United States, the reception was hesitant. The government offered polite acknowledgement but little warmth. Some hailed him as a professional who had endured without betrayal, others saw only failure, a man who had not died for secrecy. He appeared before congressional hearings, answered questions, defended his actions. Gradually, the controversy faded, replaced by new crises: Berlin, Cuba, Vietnam. The Cold War moved on, as it always did, leaving its casualties behind in the quiet margins of history. In the years that followed, the lessons of his flight reshaped intelligence itself. Satellites replaced aircraft, orbiting high above the atmosphere, untouchable and invisible. The era of spy planes gave way to the age of surveillance from space. The U-2 remained in service, refined and modernized, but its legend became a cautionary tale, a reminder that in the pursuit of knowledge, even the most calculated risk could ignite global outrage. Powers himself found a quieter path. He became a test pilot once again, later a helicopter pilot for a television station in Los Angeles. In 1977, during a routine assignment, his aircraft malfunctioned and crashed. He died trying to avoid a crowded playground, steering the failing helicopter away from the children below. The man who once flew above 70,000 feet had met his end close to the ground, still thinking of others. The wreckage of his U-2, recovered and displayed in Moscow's Central Armed Forces Museum, remains to this day a relic of the moment when pride fell from the sky. The metal is twisted, the paint scorched, the cockpit shattered, yet the symbolism endures. It stands as a monument to the cost of secrecy and the fragility of truth. For both nations, the incident marked a turning point, a lesson written not in treaties or speeches, but in wreckage and regret. History remembers battles by their victors and treaties by their signatories. But the Cold War was a different kind of war, one fought with fear, deception, and the thin illusion of control. When the U-2 fell, it exposed the human face behind that illusion, a pilot doing his duty, a general protecting his country, a leader caught between pride and peace. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the incident, not the scandal, not the politics, but the reminder that every empire, no matter how powerful, can be humbled by a single spark in the sky.